The story of the Mappila Uprising, erroneously called the Mappila Rebellion, is a story that has been rarely articulated in English and languages other than Malayalam, the language spoken in Kerala by the Mappilas themselves. The accounts that are available in English are mostly by non-Mappilas. While the Marxist narrative tries to explain the uprising as a class struggle, the dominant right-wing distortions are blatantly biased and replete with half-truths. This short film attempts to lay bare the real reasons for the Mappila uprising and prove to the hilt that the Mappilas were not communal. Yes, they were vehemently anti-imperialist and did not mince words in expressing their disgust on being ruled by a foreign power. They did not even spare their co-religionists if they found them to be conspirators and informers of the British forces. But they never spited anyone simply based on their religious beliefs. History is witness that the Mappilas themselves had accepted Islam without any coercion, and they never tried to impose their faith on their compatriots over the past so many centuries. Yes, during the short period in which the Mysorean rulers had dominated the region, they did receive favorable treatment. To set the context for this film, let us trace the history of the conquests of South India from the 14th century, briefly look at some of the misadventures of the Western countries to control the Indian Ocean trade route, especially the sea routes of the Arabian Ocean, and touch upon the role of Arab admirals called Marikars in guarding the coastline of the Hindu Zamorins and the support extended by the Zamorins to the Arab merchants. The landing of the Portuguese on the west coast of India, especially on the Malabar coast, has great significance to our study. Unlike the Arab merchants who chartered the waters of the Arabian Sea and made the Malabar their home, never intending to depose the rulers called Zamorins, nor proselytizing to people of different faiths, the Portuguese expeditions were mainly concerned in displacing the Arab seafarers, depriving them of their lucrative spice trade, and imposing their hegemony on native dwellers of the lands we call Goa, parts of Malabar, Gujarat, and even the Malacca archipelago. In the words of a famous contemporary Mappila historian, Mustafa Kamal, the main objectives behind European banditry on the high seas and attempts to take over the sea trade from the Muslims was to essentially deprive these Muslim traders the revenue which in some form or the other sustained Muslim armies that fought off the 17 consecutive attempts launched by Christian powers to take back Jerusalem after Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi defeated the Crusaders. The initial Zamorins or Samudris, who were the rulers of the Malabar area, supported the Arab traders because they served as their admirals and kept the revenue coming in through sea trade. But after multiple Portuguese victories, they succumbed and eventually handed over one of the most illustrious Arab admirals called Kunyali Marikar to the Portuguese, who took him and beheaded him. Before long, the Dutch, the French, and the British slowly overtook many of the Portuguese colonies with the exception of Goa. The British were however kept in check by the Mysoreans, led by Hyder Ali, and later by his son Tipu Sultan. After the Second Mysore War, Hyder Ali and later his son Tipu Sultan took a good part of Malabar under their control. However, having lost the Third Mysore War and subsequently the Fourth Mysore War, in which Tipu was martyred, the entire Malabar was ceded to the British. This fall of Malabar led to the further marginalization of the Mappilas, who were seen by the British as supporters of Tipu Sultan and Hyder Ali and were also despised by the local Hindus for what they perceived to be the support of the Muslims to the invading Mysoreans. This also constitutes an important background to our study. During the time when the Arab traders enjoyed the patronage of the Zamorins, The Mappilas, or those who converted to Islam from among the natives, were employed in the ports and enjoyed a high standard of living. However, with the Zamorans succumbing to the Portuguese and the Portuguese having taken over the Arab trade from the Maricars, the Mappilas were denied the opportunities to work in the ports and eventually had to take refuge in the hinterlands where they took up to subsistence farming, becoming tenants of the dominant high caste Hindus of those areas called the Genoese. The story of the Mappilas that we are now going to tell you about is from the time they became peasants under the oppressive landlordship of the Genoese or the high caste Hindus. It is to their credit that unlike the other lower caste Hindus who were equally subject to a life of misery by the upper caste Hindus, the Mappilas had time and again risen against the oppression of the Genoese, eventually having to succumb to the power that the Genoese wielded with the British overlords who supported the Genoese in suppressing the revolts by the Mappilas. Genesis of the Mappila Uprising in 1921. The late 19th century saw a steady decline in the military and economic power of the Ottomans. The avalanche started in 1874 with the Balkan territories of the Ottoman Empire revolting against their Ottoman rulers and attempting to drive out the Muslim civilians of the Balkans. This led to the Russo-Turkish War of 1876-77, culminating in the Balkan Wars of 1912-1913. This was a testing time for the Ottomans, who barely managed to save their own capital, Istanbul, from the invading Bulgarians and Tsarist Russia. To add to their woes was the unprovoked attack on Ottoman Libya during 1911 by the Italians. In many of these invasions, Britain's role was far from being neutral or pro-Ottoman. Matters came to a head when the First World War broke out and the vanquished Ottomans were forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty. It is no secret that hundreds of thousands of Indian Muslims joined the British forces in the theatres of war. Indian Muslim support to help the British forces was secured on the solemn promise of safeguarding the institution of the Caliphate and maintaining the status quo of the Islamic holy places. But Britain went back on its word. Britain's reneging on their promises agonized the Indian Muslims deeply. The Indian Muslim community vented its displeasure by holding protest rallies in different parts of the subcontinent. These meetings, like the ones convened in the wake of the Tripolitan War, the First Balkan War, and the post-World War I, passed resolutions condemning the atrocities perpetrated by the Balkan Confederacy and even raised funds to support the Ottoman army. During the 1874-1877 period, the most noteworthy endeavors were carried out by Maulana Qasim Nanotwi and his colleagues. The initiatives in support of the Ottomans, launched in the first decade of the 20th century by Maulana Abdul Bari Farangi Mahalli, Muhammad Ali Johar, Maulana Azad, Maulana Shaukat Ali, and joined by the likes of Allama Shibli Nomani, Abdul Majid Daryabadi, Dr. M.A. Ansari, and others, occupied center stage during the post-1911 period. This led to the launch of the Khilafat movement in 1919. The Khilafat leaders launched a countrywide campaign to mobilize Indian public opinion against the British rulers for their insidious role in weakening the Khilafah. This movement gained the support of eminent Hindu leaders like Mahatma Gandhi. The leaders of the Khilafat movement traveled the length and breadth of the subcontinent, organizing protest meets. They also addressed mass rallies in the Malabar, organized by the local Khilafat and Congress committees. The Mappilas have always been known for their fierce attachment to their religion. Love for their Khalifa came naturally to them, since they realized the importance of a central leadership to preserve the honor and dignity of their religion and its holy places. When the Mappilas began to notice that a weakened Ottoman Empire would put the holy lands of Mecca and Medina in the direct or indirect control of the usurping Western powers, they knew it was time to act. Their enthusiastic participation in the Khilafat movement and the non-cooperation movement throughout the region was palpable. Their rallies were disciplined and totally non-violent. The Mappila scholars organized their own meetings in support of the Ottoman Khilafah. We shall soon discuss the resolutions passed by the Mappila Ulama Conference held in May 1921. The British police could not brook these massive protest rallies. The police cracked down mercilessly on the protesters. Alongside, they arrested their leaders like Yaqub Hassan and even moderate Congress leaders of the region belonging to the Nair and the Menon communities as well. In July 1921, when the popular Mappila scholar Ali Musliar openly condemned the British and asked Muslims not to serve in the British army, the colonial government resolved to silence him. Hence, on 20th August 1921, they set out to arrest him from the Mambara Masjid in Tirurangadi. News spread that the British police desecrated the mosque during the arrest of Ali Musliar. Thousands of angry villagers marched to Tirurangadi to protest the arrest and the defilement of the mosque. British forces cracked down mercilessly on the poor Mappila peasants who were simply expressing their anger at the blatant disregard shown by the British to their religious sentiments. Many protesters fell victim to the bullets of the British police force. This was the spark that lit the fuse of the powder keg. In the face of this unremitting brutality, poorly equipped as they were, the Mappilas took to guerrilla tactics to confront the occupying forces. In the words of a noted historian, Mr. Alavi Kakadan, guerrilla methods adopted by the Mappilas served as an inspiration to many subsequent resistant movements like that of Che Guevara.
Che Guevarയ്ക്ക് പോലും ബൊളീവിയൻ കാടുകളിൽ അദ്ദേഹം നടത്തിയ ഒളിപ്പോർ പോരാട്ടത്തിന് പ്രചോദനം വാര്യംകുന്നത്ത് പശ്ചിമഘട്ട മലനിരകളിൽ 1921 ബ്രിട്ടീഷ് സാമ്രാജ്യത്തിനെതിരെ നടത്തിയ ഒളിപ്പോർ യുദ്ധങ്ങളും ഗറില്ല യുദ്ധങ്ങളിൽ നിന്നുമാണ് എന്നതാണ് സത്യം. 21 തന്നെ ഈ സംഭവം.
It must be remembered that Britain was triumphant in World War I, which had concluded just a few years before the Mappila Uprising. Moreover, they had field-tested many new and menacing machine guns and heavy artillery of those days during World War I. Despite the balance of power in their favor, the empire on which the sun never sets could not dislodge the brave Mappilas from their well-entrenched positions. For nearly 6 months, the Mappila leadership ran an efficient parallel government, which they even called the Khilafah or Caliphate, in the Ernad and Valuvanad region. In the next episode, we will examine the major battles fought between the Mappila fighters and the forces of mighty Britain. Other episodes will deal with the heroes of the uprising, the wagon tragedy, the lessons learned from the uprising, why the Malabar uprising can be called the mother of all revolutions, and most importantly, nail the canard of the Mappilas being communal. Let us close this episode with the following statement by M.G.S. Narayanan, a former chairman of the Indian Council of Historical Research. He says, "It started as a protest against British authorities, so it was part of the freedom struggle. However, since the British had appointed high caste Hindus to high positions as they needed their support, therefore the protest soon turned against the Hindus as well." Asked whether the BJP is justified in calling it an instance of jihad, Narayanan says the term jihad was not in use in those days. To coin it in reference to the movement is to introduce a term that did not exist back then. In that sense, it is unhistorical. Quotes close.
Mappila Malabar മഷഹൂറത്താണിതാറ് ചോപ്പേറും ചോര ചീന്തിയ താജുൽ അഖ്ബാറ് മാപ്പിള മലബാറ് മഷഹൂറത്താണിതാറ് ചോപ്പേറും ചോര